Our second lesson this morning picks up a few chapters later in the Gospel of John, but still on the same night, the last night of Jesus' life. Hear this reading from John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18 and 25 through 27. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing round it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In a sermon I preached last summer, I talked about a phrase I learned in a seminary class called marriage and family systems. The phrase was this: you marry the right person for all the wrong reasons. So it surprised me recently when a colleague of mine told me about an article by the philosopher Alain de Botton on the state of the modern marriage. In this article, de Botton wastes no time getting right to the point. He begins like this: "It's one of those things we are most afraid might happen to us. We go to great lengths to avoid it, and yet we do it all the same. We marry the wrong person." In explaining why this happens, de Botton points out that the closer we get to someone, the better we know them, the more aware we become of their imperfections and idiosyncrasies and all the ways they fail to live up to our often unspoken and even unconscious expectations. In de Botton's words, we seem normal only to those who don't know us very well. In a wiser, more self-aware society than our own, a standard question on any early dinner date would be, "And how are you crazy?" My colleague actually tells couples that he is marrying about de Botton's article when he's marrying them, and he says it's a good thing they don't have a photographer taking a picture of their expressions at the time. But de Botton argues that becoming disenchanted with a romantic partner is democratic. It happens to everyone. And although his focus is on romantic partnerships, most of us also discover, sooner or later, that such disenchantment doesn't just apply to marriage. The closer we are to anyone, whether that is a partner, a family member, or a friend, the more we witness their quirks and annoying habits, and the more likely we are to question why we stay with that relationship. Now, my colleague takes this whole theory one step further. He applies it not just to relationships between people, but relationships between people and institutions, and specifically between people and churches. Stay in a church long enough, he says, and you will get disenchanted. Why? Because churches are full of people. And people are wildly inconsistent and consistently imperfect. Stay in a church, any church, long enough, and chances are you may start to think you've made a mistake. You've joined the wrong church. I suspect Jesus knows this is exactly what's going to happen to every one of us, because it's what happened from the very beginning. On the last night of his earthly life, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus spent a long and intimate evening with his disciples, sharing a last meal with them, imparting wisdom they can ponder after he's gone, and taking time to kneel down and wash the feet of these wildly inconsistent, consistently imperfect, and maddeningly thick-headed men who are also his closest friends. Before he leaves them, the most important thing Jesus does is teach them in word and in deed about love. The love he tries to show them and tell them about is love that goes far beyond affection or excitement or erotic desire or heady emotion. Jesus teaches his disciples about a love that goes beyond anything they've ever experienced, because it is a love that has been manifested in the world for the first time in human form, in the person of Jesus, God incarnate, God's love in the flesh. Although Jesus goes to great lengths that night to teach his disciples the nature of this divine love, the disciples utterly fail to grasp it, as Jesus already knows they will. Where I am going now, you cannot come, he tells them. Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow me afterwards. Jesus has been trying for some time now to prepare his disciples for what has to happen to him: betrayal, crucifixion, resurrection. But on this last night, he seems resigned to the fact that they are not going to be able to grasp any of it until after it happens. And even then, it will be a long process of wrestling with just what Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is all about. Jesus also knows that before the disciples can begin to understand the kind of love he has for them and for the whole world, they will have to come to terms with their own shortcomings. Very truly, I tell you, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, who has never wanted anything more than to be the disciple who gets it and who loves and understands Jesus most and best of all, truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times. Despite Peter's vehement protest that he would ever do such a thing, it happens. And the only thing worse for Peter than the denial itself is just how easily and accurately Jesus predicted it. When Richard Rohr's mother was on her deathbed, she kept talking about a mesh she couldn't get through, something that was keeping her from letting go and surrendering to the death that was inevitable. Rohr sat by her bed and told her how much he would miss her. I want to hear that from Daddy, she said. Daddy was what they all called Rohr's father, her husband, and he came over to the bed and told her again how much he would miss her. She replied, I don't believe it. Rohr was horrified. Mother, he said, you're a few hours from death. You can't say that. But she said it again. I don't believe it. Rohr's father looked his wife in the eye and said, I ask your forgiveness for all the times I've hurt you in our 54 years of marriage, and I forgive you for all the times you've hurt me. Rohr said, Mother, isn't that beautiful? Now say that back to Daddy. But she closed her mouth and shook her head. She didn't want to say it. Rohr said, Mother, you're soon going to be before God. You don't want to come before God without forgiving everybody. I forgive everybody, she said. Rohr said, but do you forgive Daddy? And she was silent. In recalling this moment, Rohr writes, my siblings and I still don't know how Daddy hurt Mother. But any married person knows there are many little ways a couple hurt one another over 54 years. So Roar took his mother's hand and told her to put one hand on her heart. He told her, "I'm going to pray that your heart gets real soft." And he held her other hand and kissed it. After a moment, she spoke, "When you kiss my hand like that, now I've got to do it." And then, "I'm a stubborn woman. All my life, I've been a stubborn woman." "Mother, we all know that," Roar said. "Now look at Daddy and tell him." She looked over and she spoke her husband's given name. "Rich," she said, "I forgive you." She took a few deep breaths and then said, "Rich, I ask your forgiveness." And after a few breaths more, she said, "That's it. That's it. That's what I had to do." On their last night together, with just 32 words, Jesus offers his disciples a summation of the whole gospel. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, so you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. I think the reason we usually relegate this text to one weeknight service a year, Maundy Thursday, is because it is really hard for us to hear, and even harder to understand and to practice. When he's got one last chance to tell us what he wants us to know, Jesus doesn't say, "Hold one another accountable," or "resist temptation," or "follow those 10 commandments," or "give all your money to the church," or even "make me proud." He tells us to love one another, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't feel good, even after we have betrayed one another in 1,000 big and small ways. Even then, God calls us to remember how Jesus showed love by washing the feet of those who misunderstood him and would betray him, and then by dying on a cross for those same disciples and for every one of us. God calls us to love one another in just this way. In his article about how we all choose the wrong spouse, de Botton has some advice. He suggests that we swap out the romantic view of marriage, the stuff of expensive destination weddings, romantic comedies, and fairy tales. He recommends we swap that out for a view of marriage that is decidedly more pessimistic, but also more realistic. He advises us to accept that every human being, and I would add every human institution, will frustrate, anger, annoy, madden, and disappoint us, and we will, without any malice, do the same to them. This awareness can help us value our relationships and measure them, not so much by how our loved ones make us feel, but by how well we can navigate our differences and disagreements with them. What makes our relationships meaningful, valuable, and satisfying is not when we share everything in common or see everything the same way, but when we develop our mutual capacity to tolerate our differences and disagreements with generosity and grace. When Ben started middle school, he decided he wanted to develop a whole new persona. The youngest of 3 kids, he was tired of being seen as the baby, so he decided to become the tough guy. That's how, just a couple of weeks into the school year, he found himself at a center of a crowd on the playground, beating up a kid he didn't even know, who challenged him earlier in the day. Ben had never been in a fight before, and he was uncovering talents he didn't know he had. He landed a couple of good punches to the other kid's mouth, and soon the kid was bleeding badly. But Ben didn't stop. Something inside him was fueling him, and he kept landing punches. At one point, he grabbed the necklace around the kid's neck and yanked it right off. Predictably, by the next morning, Ben was in the principal's office with his horrified parents. They begged the principal to give Ben another chance instead of long-term suspension or even expulsion. Ben learned that the kid he'd beaten up had a heart condition. The necklace around his neck was a medical ID tag. Luckily, he was okay. That night, Ben's parents called him into their bedroom. Ben knew this was the moment of reckoning. He was in huge trouble. What he never could have anticipated is what happened next. His parents apologized to him. "We've realized we haven't been there for you," they said. "We've been preoccupied lately with your brother and sister, and we thought that you were doing okay. We know we were wrong. We've made a mistake. We're going to spend more time with you. We're going to make sure you get on and stay on the right path. We love you, and we're sorry." This is the kind of love Jesus speaks of and demonstrates on the last night of his life as he prepares to sacrifice himself so that the world might catch a glimpse of love's potential, even in the face of betrayal and misunderstandings and disagreements and unthinkable violence and suffering. Jesus shows us what it looks like to move beyond our romantic notions of love as the good feelings that come when we all just get along and seem to agree. The kind of love God shows us in Jesus is only possible when we are brutally and beautifully honest about all the things we don't share in common, all the things we disagree on, and then when we exercise forgiveness, compassion, and even humor to find a way forward together. This is the most important and valuable example that Christ's church can set in a world that is exceedingly and increasingly divided. It is not to wall off ourselves with people who see things the same way we do, but to willingly and honestly show up, flawed and vulnerable and inconsistent as we are, to show up, admit our differences, and engage them together. This is what life beyond love looks like. It is what God has shown us and what Jesus promises us is possible. Together, may we make it so. Amen.